The sun hung low in the sky, casting a burning orange glow across the desert. Jesse Harper, a seasoned rancher from Texas, had found himself lost in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Days of traveling through the endless dry land had worn him down. He had been separated from his horse during a terrible sandstorm. The powerful winds had whipped up the desert, turning it into a maze of shifting dunes and dust. As the storm passed, Jesse found himself alone, with no way to know which direction he had come from. Jesse was no stranger to hard work. He had spent his life working on his family's ranch, raising cattle and taming the land. He was tough, strong, and always ready to face whatever challenge came his way. But now, faced with the harsh desert, he realized that even the toughest man can be brought to his knees by nature's power. With every step he took, the heat seemed to press down harder on him. The dry air burned in his throat and his clothes clung to his skin, heavy with sweat. He had been walking for hours, but the desert offered no shade, no relief. His mind was clouded with confusion and his body screamed for rest. He knew that if he didn't find water soon, he might not survive. He had been following what he thought was a path, but it turned out to be nothing more than the tracks of an animal. His water had run out 2 days ago, and the last bit of jerky he had eaten was long gone. His stomach growled in protest, but there was nothing he could do. All he could think about now was finding shelter, finding someone, anyone, who could help him. The desert seemed endless, like an ocean of sand stretching as far as the eye could see. Every hill he climbed only revealed more of the same. His hope began to fade. His legs felt like lead and his vision blurred from the heat. He was losing energy fast. He had been walking for what felt like days, and yet there was still no sign of life. No animals, no people, just the vast emptiness of the desert. As the sun began to set, Jesse felt his strength begin to give way. He knew he had to find shelter before nightfall. The cold of the desert night would be just as deadly as the heat of the day if he didn't take cover soon. His legs buckled beneath him and he collapsed onto the sand. His eyes fluttered closed, and for a moment, he thought he might drift off into unconsciousness. But something deep inside him pushed him to stay awake. Jesse's breathing was shallow, his heart racing with fear. He was alone. No one knew where he was. The ranch was miles away, and he had no way of contacting anyone. A feeling of dread washed over him. Was this how it would end? Lost in the desert with no one to help? As he lay there staring up at the starless sky, he heard something, soft whispers on the wind. At first he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, a result of the exhaustion and thirst that had taken over his body. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and Jesse could make out words. Sleep here. The voice was gentle, soft, yet commanding. It wasn't the voice of a man. It sounded like a young girl, perhaps even several girls. Jesse turned his head, trying to make out where the voice was coming from. But there was no one there, just the empty desert stretching in every direction. He was too weak to stand, too tired to search. The voice came again, this time more clearly. Sleep here. Jesse's heart raced and a shiver ran down his spine. The desert had a way of playing tricks on people, but this felt different. He had heard those words. Someone was near him, someone who knew he was in need. Jesse struggled to sit up, but his limbs were heavy and uncooperative. Then, out of the shadows, 3 figures appeared. They emerged from the darkness like ghosts, their movements swift and silent. At first, Jesse thought he was imagining them, but as they came closer, he saw them more clearly. 3 young girls, no older than 16, dressed in simple, worn clothing that seemed to blend with the desert around them. Their faces were calm, their eyes bright and clear despite the darkness. Jesse blinked, unsure if he was seeing things. His mouth was dry and his throat felt like it was closing up, but he didn't question the girls. Something about them felt real. One of the girls, the oldest looking of the 3, stepped forward. She had long, dark hair tied back with a leather strip, and her skin was the color of the earth itself, smooth and weathered by the sun. She looked at Jesse with a mixture of curiosity and understanding, as though she had seen many like him before. Sleep here, she repeated softly, her voice calm and reassuring. Jesse's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Who were these girls? How had they found him in the middle of the desert? And why did they seem so at home here in this vast empty place? Despite the confusion, Jesse felt a strange sense of peace. The girls didn't seem to be afraid of him. In fact, they seemed to be waiting for him to follow them. It was almost as if they had been expecting him. The oldest girl reached out her hand, offering him help. Jesse hesitated for a moment, but then he realized he had nothing left. He had no strength to argue, no energy to refuse. He needed help, and perhaps these girls could offer it. With her guidance, Jesse slowly rose to his feet. The world around him seemed to shift. The desert no longer as vast and threatening as it had been just moments ago. The girls led him to a small shelter that had been built near a cluster of rocks. It wasn't much, just a simple structure made of branches and cloth, but it was enough to keep out the wind and the cold. They motioned for him to sit, and Jesse did as he was told, his body thankful for the rest. One of the girls handed him a canteen, and Jesse took it eagerly, drinking deeply. The water was cool, and he could feel it soothing his parched throat. The girls didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. Their presence was calming, and Jesse felt a sense of safety that he hadn't felt since before the storm had struck. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the desert, and for the first time in days he felt a glimmer of hope. The morning sun had barely risen when Jesse woke up, feeling surprisingly rested. His body, sore and tired from days of walking through the desert, had been given a moment of peace. The shelter where the girls had led him was simple but comfortable enough to provide the rest he so desperately needed. The canvas roof swayed slightly in the breeze, and the air felt cool compared to the intense heat from the day before. Jesse opened his eyes slowly, still unsure if what had happened the night before had been real. Had he really heard those voices calling to him? Had those girls truly appeared out of nowhere? He sat up and rubbed his face, trying to shake off the lingering confusion. When he looked around, the girls were already awake, standing outside the shelter, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They seemed calm and at ease, as if the desert was home to them. The same desert that had nearly claimed his life just a few hours earlier. Jesse stood up and walked over to them, his legs still a little unsteady. The eldest girl, who had spoken to him the night before, turned to face him with a quiet smile. Her dark eyes shone with a wisdom Jesse couldn't quite understand. There was something about her that made him feel like he wasn't a stranger here, something that made him feel like he was meant to be here, in this very moment. "Thank you," Jesse said, his voice hoarse from thirst. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." She nodded but said nothing. Instead, she gestured for him to follow her, and without questioning it, Jesse did. The other two girls, equally silent but watchful, moved ahead, their feet leaving soft impressions in the sand. Jesse followed them toward a nearby rocky outcrop, where a small stream trickled through the rocks. It wasn't much, just a few inches of water, but it was enough to quench his thirst. As they stopped by the stream, the eldest girl gestured for Jesse to drink, and he eagerly knelt beside the water. The cool liquid felt like a blessing, refreshing him in ways he hadn't expected. As he drank, he glanced at the girls who stood nearby, observing him with quiet patience. "You are Apache?" Jesse asked after drinking his fill. The eldest girl's eyes flickered slightly, and she gave a slight nod. "We are," she said softly. "We live in the desert. This is our land. The wind knows us. The earth knows us." Jesse was intrigued. He had heard stories about the Apache people, their deep connection to the land and their legendary survival skills in the harshest conditions, but he had never met them. He had always heard that they were a proud and secretive people, keeping to themselves and living outside the reach of outsiders like him. "Your voices," Jesse continued, his curiosity growing. "The night before, I heard you calling to me. It was as if you knew I was here." The eldest girl studied him for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. "The desert speaks to us," she said simply. "It knows when someone is lost, when someone is in need. The earth calls to us and we listen." Jesse's mind was spinning with questions, but the girl didn't seem to want to say much more. Instead, she motioned for him to follow her again. The other two girls had already started walking up a narrow path that led toward a larger rock formation in the distance. Jesse fell into step behind them, feeling a sense of unease creeping in. Was this a dream? Trick of the heat? Or had he truly encountered something beyond his understanding? As they walked, Jesse couldn't help but notice the ease with which the girls moved through the desert. They walked with purpose, their steps sure and confident. It was as if they were one with the land, as though the desert had no secrets for them. For Jesse, every step felt like a battle against the elements, but the girls seemed to glide effortlessly, as if the desert was their home, their domain. They reached the rock formation after a while, And Jesse was surprised to see a small camp set up among the rocks. There was a fire pit, a few simple shelters made of animal hides, and a group of people who seemed to be going about their daily tasks. The camp was alive with quiet activity, and Jesse could sense the presence of many others nearby. The girl who had spoken to him earlier led him into the camp, where the people greeted her with nods of respect. They looked at Jesse with interest but didn't approach him directly. The air felt thick with the weight of their gazes, as if they were all waiting for something, watching and listening. Jesse followed the eldest girl to a spot by the fire, where she motioned for him to sit. He hesitated, unsure if he should, but then he decided there was no harm in following her lead. As he sat down, one of the other girls brought over a small bowl of food, dried meat and some kind of grain. It wasn't much, but Jesse was too hungry to care. As he ate, the people around him continued their quiet tasks. Some were tending to the fire, others were preparing hides, and a few were sitting together speaking softly in a language Jesse couldn't understand. He looked over at the eldest girl, wondering if she would explain any more about the Apache way of life. But instead of answering his questions, she simply watched him with quiet eyes, as though she were studying him. Jesse couldn't help but feel that there was more to this than just a random encounter. Something had drawn him here, something that went beyond mere chance. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice calm and steady. The desert is both a teacher and a test. It shows us who we are, how we live, how we survive. It shows us what we can learn from the land and from each other. Jesse thought about her words carefully. He had spent his whole life on the land working hard to survive, but he had never thought about it in the way the girl described. To him, the land had always been something to conquer, something to control. But now, after everything that had happened, he was beginning to realize that maybe the land wasn't something to be controlled at all. It was a lesson that was slowly sinking in, and Jesse knew that he had a lot to learn. This part continues to build the mystery surrounding the Apache girls, and Jesse's growing realization that his encounter with them was no accident. The desert seems to be calling to him, and the Apache way of life offers him a perspective he hadn't considered before. Let me know if you'd like any further changes or additions. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert as Jesse sat by the fire, still trying to understand the strange and unexpected turn his life had taken. The Apache camp had settled into a peaceful routine. The men and women went about their evening tasks, the children played quietly near the fire, and the air was filled with the sounds of the desert night, crickets chirping, the rustle of wind through the trees, and the occasional distant call of an owl. Jesse had been silent most of the evening, absorbing everything that had happened since the girls had first found him. They had led him to their camp, fed him, and shown him kindness in a way he had never expected. But as much as they had shared with him, he still felt like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong. These people, so in tune with the desert, with the land that Jesse had spent his entire life trying to tame, seemed to have an understanding that he couldn't grasp. The eldest girl, whom Jesse had come to know as Taza, sat beside him. Her dark eyes were fixed on the fire, but she didn't speak. For a long time, neither of them said a word. The fire crackled softly, sending occasional sparks into the air. Finally, Jesse broke the silence. "I don't understand," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the sound of the flames. "I've spent my life working the land. I thought I knew it all. But everything you've shown me, it's different. It's not what I expected. How do you live like this in the desert, without all the things I've relied on?" Taza turned to him, her gaze steady but not judgmental. "You are not the first to ask this question," she said softly. "The desert is both kind and cruel. It gives life, but it takes life. It is not about relying on what you can control. It is about understanding what you cannot control." Jesse frowned, trying to understand her words. "But I've worked so hard to make my ranch grow. The land, the cattle, it all comes from my hard work. I thought that's what it took to survive." Taza smiled faintly, her eyes flickering with something like amusement. "It is true that hard work is important, but the land does not belong to you. You are not the master of the land. You are a part of it. You are a guest. If you treat the land with respect, it will help you. If you take too much or try to control it, it will fight back." Jesse sat back, thinking about her words. It wasn't a way of thinking he had ever considered before. To him, the land had always been something to be conquered, a tool to make his life better, a place to build his ranch and raise his cattle. But Taza was telling him that the land wasn't just something to use. It was something to live with, something to respect. He had always seen himself as a strong, independent man, someone who could do everything on his own. But here, with the Apache, he was learning that strength didn't come from control. It came from understanding, from harmony. Before he could respond, the youngest of the three girls, a girl with bright eyes and a curious smile, appeared at his side. She was holding something in her hands wrapped in a cloth. She gestured for Jesse to follow her, and he rose to his feet, still a bit unsure of what to expect. Taza stood as well, watching him with a soft, knowing expression. "Come," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You must see something." Jesse followed the girls through the camp, past the fire, and toward a small hill that rose up from the desert floor. As they climbed, the soft sand gave way to rocky ground, and Jesse could feel his heart beat faster. What could they possibly want to show him here? At the top of the hill, the youngest girl unwrapped the cloth in her hands. Inside, Jesse saw a small bundle of herbs, dried plants, some with bright red flowers, others with long, slender leaves. The girl held the bundle out to Jesse, her smile wide and eager. "These plants are medicine," she said in broken English. "They heal the body and the spirit. We use them when someone is sick or tired. They help us remember our place in the world." Jesse took the herbs from her hands, feeling the weight of them in his palms. They smelled earthy, almost sweet, and he could sense the quiet power they held. The desert was full of life, he realized, even if it didn't look like it at first glance. These plants, these small things, were the key to survival here. Taza's voice broke into his thoughts. "The land gives us what we need if we know how to take care of it. These plants are here to remind us that we are part of the circle. We take, but we must also give. That is the way of life in the desert." Jesse nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling deep within him. For the first time in his life, he understood what she meant. The land wasn't just a resource to be used. It was a living thing full of wisdom and life, and if he wanted to survive here, he would have to learn to live in balance with it, not in opposition. The night air grew cooler as they sat together on the hill, the firelight from the camp flickering below them. Jesse could feel the peace that settled over him, a peace he hadn't known in years. His life on the ranch had always been about struggle, about fighting the land, fighting the weather, and fighting to make his way in the world. But now, surrounded by these people in the heart of the desert, he felt a new kind of strength. It was quiet, humble, and unshakable. It was the strength of knowing that he didn't have to do everything alone. After a while, Taza stood and stretched, her movements fluid and graceful. "You should rest," she said. "Tomorrow we will show you more. There is much to learn." Jesse didn't argue. He knew she was right. He had much to learn. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of calm settle within him, as though he had finally found a place where he could begin again. The girls led him back to the camp, and as they reached the fire, Jesse felt a deep sense of gratitude. These people, so different from him in so many ways, had saved him, not just from the desert, but from the narrow way he had been living his life. They had shown him a new path, a path of respect, of balance, and of understanding. He sat down beside the fire, the warmth of the flames soothing him, and looked up at the stars above. For the first time in days, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel lost. The desert, with all its mystery and danger, had become something more, a teacher, a guide, and a friend. The days in the Apache camp passed quietly, and Jesse slowly began to feel the weight of the desert lift from his shoulders. Each morning, Taza and the other girls led him deeper into the land, showing him how to gather food, how to find water, and how to live in harmony with the earth. At first, Jesse had felt like an outsider, unsure of his place in this new world. But as time passed, he began to feel something change inside him. The desert was no longer a place of danger. It was a place of wisdom. It was a place that gave and took, but always in balance. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Taza approached Jesse as he sat by the fire. She had a soft smile on her face, but her eyes were serious. "Today you will go with the men," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It is time for you to learn more about the Apache way. The desert is not only about survival. It is about understanding the world and finding your place in it." Jesse looked up at her, surprised. He had spent most of his time with the women and children of the camp, learning the skills of gathering and preparing food. But now Taza was asking him to go with the men. He wasn't sure what this meant, but he knew that he had to trust her. The Apache way was not something that could be learned in a few days. It was a journey that took time, patience, and an open mind. Taza motioned for him to follow, and together, they walked to the far side of the camp, where a group of men were preparing for a hunt. They were gathering their bows and arrows, checking the leather straps on their gear, and speaking quietly among themselves. Jesse could feel the quiet strength in their presence. These were men who had spent their lives in the desert, and their movements were precise and sure. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a weathered face, stepped forward as Taza approached. He gave her a respectful nod before turning his gaze to Jesse. His name was Hakim, and he was the leader of the hunting group. "You will join us today," Hakim said, his voice deep and steady. "But remember, the desert teaches us more than just how to hunt. It teaches us about ourselves, about patience, about balance." Jesse nodded, trying to hide his nerves. He had never been much of a hunter, but he was willing to learn. After all, he had come to the desert to understand more about the land and the people who lived here. If this was part of the journey, then he would follow. The group set out as the sun climbed higher in the sky, walking in a line across the desert. Jesse kept his eyes on the ground, trying to learn the ways of the Apache hunters. The men moved quietly, their footsteps light on the sand. They didn't speak much, but when they did, their words were measured, careful. Everything had purpose here, even the way they walked. As they walked, Hakim explained the importance of silence. "The desert is alive," he said. "Every sound, every movement has meaning. If you listen closely, you will hear the earth speak." Jesse listened, but all he heard were the wind and the occasional call of a bird. He didn't know what Hakim meant, but he was beginning to realize that there was a deeper meaning in everything. The wind, the rocks, the animals. Everything in the desert was connected, and the Apache knew how to listen to that connection. After several hours of walking, they reached a small valley where the earth dipped down into a narrow canyon. Hakim motioned for everyone to stop. He held up his hand, signaling that they were getting close to their quarry. "This is the place," Hakim said quietly. "Now we wait." Jesse looked around, but he couldn't see anything. The valley seemed empty, the rocks silent under the midday sun. But as the group crouched low, Jesse began to notice small signs of life, a trail of footprints in the dust, fresh droppings of an animal, the faint rustle of leaves in the distance. For the next several hours they waited. The sun grew hotter, and the air seemed to shimmer in the heat. Jesse's legs ached from crouching, but he said nothing. He focused on the silence, trying to understand the patience that the Apache had mastered. They didn't rush. They didn't hurry. They waited, watching and listening for the signs that told them it was time to act. Finally, as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, the moment came. A deer stepped cautiously into the valley, its ears twitching as it sniffed the air. The group held their breath, watching the animal with steady eyes. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Hakim gave a subtle signal, and the men moved as one. They were fast and quiet, each of them knowing exactly where to position themselves. Jesse followed their lead, though he wasn't as quick or silent as the others. But to his surprise, the deer didn't run. It seemed almost unaware of the danger. The Apache hunters moved with incredible precision, and in a matter of moments the hunt was over. The deer lay still on the ground, the result of a well-placed arrow. Hakim knelt beside the animal, touching its body gently with respect. "We take life," he said, his voice low, "but we do not take it lightly. The deer gives itself to us so that we may live. We honor it by using every part of it." Jesse watched in awe as the men carefully began to prepare the deer, using every part of it for food, clothing, and tools. There was no waste. Everything had a purpose and nothing was thrown away. It was a lesson in respect and balance. As the group made their way back to camp with the deer, Jesse felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. The hunt had been a quiet, patient act of survival, but it was more than that. It was an act of respect for the land, for the animals, and for each other. That night, as they sat around the fire and shared the meal they had earned, Jesse felt a deep connection to the Apache way of life. He realized that the land was not something to be conquered or controlled. It was something to be understood and respected. The Apache didn't just live in the desert, they lived with it. As the fire crackled and the stars began to fill the sky, Jesse looked around at the people of the camp. They were more than just survivors. They were teachers, and the desert was their classroom. Jesse had come to the desert lost and alone, but now he felt like he was finding his way. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. In this part, Jesse begins to truly understand the Apache way of life, learning from the men about the deep connection between them, the land and the animals. The hunting trip is a key moment in his transformation, teaching him patience, respect, and balance. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. Jesse had been in the Apache camp for nearly a month now, and every day seemed to reveal something new. His time in the desert had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. The lessons he had learned from Taza, Hakeem, and the other Apache people were slowly becoming a part of him. The desert, once a harsh and unforgiving place, had transformed into a living, breathing part of his world. It was no longer something to fear. It was something to understand, respect, and cherish. Each day, Jesse worked alongside the Apache people. He learned the art of weaving baskets, making tools from bones and stones, and how to properly track animals across the desert. The men taught him how to use a bow and arrow, and the women showed him how to gather plants and herbs that could be used for food and medicine. Taza spent hours teaching him the language of the Apache, and although Jesse still stumbled over many words, he began to understand the meaning behind them. It wasn't just the words that mattered. It was the way the language connected the people to the land, to each other, and to the spirit of the earth. The more Jesse learned, the more he felt a growing sense of peace inside him. For the first time in his life, he no longer felt like he had to control everything. He had spent so many years trying to force his ranch to succeed, fighting against the land, against nature. But now he realized that true strength came from harmony, not from control. One morning, as the sun rose over the desert, Taza approached him with a serious look in her eyes. "Today," she said, "I want you to see the land in a different way." Jesse raised an eyebrow but said nothing, knowing that when Taza spoke like this, it was best to listen. She led him to a small hill on the edge of the camp, where they could see for miles in every direction. The wind blew gently and the quiet beauty of the desert stretched out before them. "You have learned much here," Taza said, her voice calm. "But now you must see the land through different eyes. You must see it as it truly is." Jesse stood next to her, looking out at the desert that had become his home. It was empty, vast, and seemingly lifeless. But as he stood there, he began to see what she meant. The desert was alive, not in the way the forests and rivers were, with trees and flowing water, but in its own quiet, powerful way. The wind shaped the dunes, the sun painted the sky, and the animals moved through the earth with purpose. It was all part of a delicate balance, a rhythm that only those who truly understood it could see. Taza turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "The land does not belong to us," she said. "We belong to the land. If we live in balance with it, it will provide for us. If we try to take too much, it will take from us." Jesse nodded slowly, feeling the truth of her words deep in his heart. He had come to the desert a man who thought he knew everything, a man who had spent his life trying to bend the land to his will. But now he saw that there was so much more to learn. There was a wisdom in the land that he had never understood before, and it was that wisdom that the Apache people had lived by for generations. That evening, as the camp gathered around the fire, Jesse spoke for the first time about his life before the desert. He told them about his ranch, his cattle, and the struggle to make it all work. He spoke of the loneliness he had felt, the constant battle to survive, and the way he had always been focused on what he could control. "I thought I was strong," Jesse said, his voice filled with quiet emotion. "But I see now that I was wrong. I spent so much time fighting the land I never stopped to listen to it. I never understood that I was just a part of it." The Apache people listened in silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of understanding and wisdom. Taza smiled at him, a gentle smile that held no judgment, only acceptance. "You are not the first to learn this lesson," she said softly, "and you will not be the last. We all must learn to listen, to the land, to the sky, to the wind. The desert speaks, and if we listen, it will show us the way." Jesse felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he spoke these words. For the first time in his life, he felt at peace. The desert had not only given him the gift of survival, but it had also given him the gift of understanding. He no longer felt the need to fight against the world around him. He had learned that true strength came from humility, from the ability to adapt and live in balance with the world. In the weeks that followed, Jesse became a part of the Apache community in a way he had never expected. He worked with them, learned from them, and helped them when needed. The lessons he had learned in the desert were becoming a part of him. He no longer thought of himself as just a rancher. He was a steward of the land, a caretaker, just like the Apache people. He no longer viewed the desert as a place to conquer. He saw it for what it was, a place of life, of connection, and of deep wisdom. One day, Taza came to him with a serious look in her eyes. "It is time for you to return to your ranch," she said. "But you are not the same man who left it. You have learned much, and now it is time for you to share those lessons with others." Jesse hesitated. He didn't want to leave the Apache people. He had found a home here, a place where he truly belonged. But he knew that Taza was right. He had learned what he needed to learn, and now it was time to take those lessons back to the land he had once tried to control. "I don't know if I'm ready," Jesse said, his voice unsure. Taza smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "You are ready. You have learned the most important lesson of all. It is not about controlling the land. It is about living with it." Jesse nodded, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never be the same again. The desert had changed him. The Apache people had changed him. And now he would go back to his ranch not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker, ready to live in balance with the land he had once tried to control. As he said his goodbyes to the Apache camp and started his journey back home, Jesse felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had come to the desert lost and alone, but now he was leaving with something far more precious than any material wealth. He had found a new way of living, a way that was in harmony with the world around him, a way that honored the land and its wisdom. The journey was long, but Jesse knew he was ready. He had found his place in the world, and he was determined to make sure the land he returned to would thrive just as he had.